She thought cancelling the Queen's memorial would go unnoticed. No press, no papers, just quiet orders down the chain. Take down the chairs, remove the wreath, end the tradition, all to make room for her. But when Sergeant Corin Ashwell stepped into that courtyard and saw the Queen's candlelight vigil dismantled for a Camilla charity gala, he didn't file a complaint, he didn't speak to HR, he stood between her memory and the woman trying to erase it. And when Camilla showed up in person and called the Queen's legacy sentimental clutter, he said 10 words that shook Windsor to its foundation. Now, before we show you the moment the guard refused to step aside, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, tap subscribe with the bell icon turned on, and stay right here. Because today, the monarchy tried to cancel its own memory, and the Royal Guard refused. The morning light at Windsor Castle was cold and angular, the kind that sharpened every edge of stone, caught in the creases of brass buckles, and left no room for softness. The courtyard smelled like frost and limestone, like history compressed into silence. Drill formations moved in near-perfect sync across the green, rifles shouldered, gloved hands steady. No commands were shouted. Every step, every pause had already been rehearsed into memory. Sergeant Corin Ashwell walked the perimeter without speaking. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to tighten a shoulder here, straighten a spine there. The men knew what this morning was, what it had been every October since the Queen's passing. The annual memorial was never publicised. No cameras, no press, no plaques hung afterward to announce what had been done. Just guards and silence, and a wreath laid at the foot of the Queen's chapel window. It was the only ceremonial observance Her Majesty had personally ordered before her death, a quiet tribute held not in pomp but in posture. Corin had stood for every single one. He'd been on rotation in Helmond when the Queen died. Returned 2 weeks later to find Windsor changed, quieter, somehow heavier, like someone had removed all the clocks and no one knew what time it was anymore. It had been Princess Anne who read the decree aloud that first year, standing in the chapel doorway with her coat still wet from rain. For as long as the guards march, she shall be remembered. Privately. Properly. Corin remembered those words more clearly than any combat debriefing he'd ever been given. He was halfway through inspecting the left formation when he saw them. 2 royal aides in grey coats, hands full of clipboards and intent. They moved like they didn't belong in the courtyard. The guards didn't acknowledge them, but Corin did. They stopped just inside the marble archway. The taller one cleared his throat as Corin approached. "Sergeant Ashwell," he said, reading directly from the paper in his hand like it might protect him. "You are hereby informed that by directive of Her Majesty, the Queen Consort, the scheduled memorial ceremony is to be postponed indefinitely, effective immediately." The words echoed far louder than the aide had intended. Even the guards at the far end of the square glanced sideways. Corin didn't blink. "Signed by whom?" the aide faltered. "It's a verbal directive," said the second, younger one. His voice cracked slightly. "Issued this morning. The Queen Consort's position is that the monarchy must look forward. The Queen herself wouldn't have wanted sentimentality to burden the future." A long silence stretched between them. Somewhere above, a gull cried out and vanished behind the chapel roof. Then Corin took a single step forward. "That's not sentiment," he said, low and steady. "That's service." He turned, barked a crisp order. "Continue formation!" And the drill resumed, rifles clicking back into synchronized readiness. The aides flinched as if they'd walked into live fire. "You're defying an instruction," the taller one said, more nervous now. "No," Corin replied. "I'm waiting for it in writing." The aides exchanged a glance, then stepped back, muttering as they went. One of them whispered something Corin couldn't quite hear, but he caught the shape of it, the tone. "He's taking it personally," the younger one said. Corin turned just enough to let them see his face. "Damn right I am," he muttered. He resumed his walk across the courtyard, boots cutting through the frost with deliberate weight, a soldier holding formation not for show, but for memory. And nothing was going to move him without proof. The corridors of Windsor were quieter than usual. Not the good kind of quiet, not the reverent hush of history breathing through limestone. This was the kind of silence that pressed against doors, stuck to tapestries, and filled the gaps between footsteps like something waiting to be said but never written down. Corin moved through the palace like a man on patrol in hostile territory. Not outwardly aggressive, just alert, watchful, listening for the sound beneath the sound. He passed junior aides, speaking in lowered tones near the registry alcove. "She thinks it's outdated," one said, clutching a sheaf of printed briefings. She called it grief theatre, said it weighs down the family's public image. She actually said that. I was there. Said the palace should stop living in the echo of a 96-year-old woman's reign. Corin kept walking, didn't stop, but his jaw locked tight enough to hurt. He turned to the corner into the west hallway, approaching the small conference vestibule where final event logistics were usually processed. Through the open glass doors, he caught the tail end of a conversation between event director Alastair Ridley and Camilla's press secretary, a thin man in a suit that looked like it had been ironed by committee. "It's just a candlelit wreath ceremony," the secretary was saying, flipping through something on his tablet. "Not a state funeral. We need to sunset some of these things before they become canon." Ridley hesitated. "I understand. But it's a Coldstream event, not press-facing. And you know how the senior guards—" "She wants it gone," the secretary interrupted. "No arguments, no photos, just nothing." Ridley looked around, uneasy, then caught sight of Corin's reflection in the display glass. The press secretary turned too late. Corin stepped forward, boots precise, voice steady. "Say that again." The man blinked. "Excuse me?" Corin didn't raise his voice. "Say it again, about how remembrance becomes inconvenient." Ridley rushed in. "Sergeant Ashwell, this isn't your purview." "Then maybe it should be," Corin snapped. His gaze didn't waver. "If the press is rewriting what we guard, I'd like to know who I'm saluting." The secretary bristled. "Modernization is inevitable. Her Majesty wants the palace to breathe again." Corin stepped closer, quiet fury in his voice. "It breathed because of her." Ridley raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Sergeant, we're not erasing anything. It's just modern monarchy needs to be forward-facing." "Then walk forward without trampling where she stood," Corin said. There was a beat of charged silence, the kind that makes people remember where they were when they heard it. Ridley sighed. "If you're looking for documentation, there isn't any. Just verbal guidance from the Queen Consort herself." Corin tilted his head, tone cutting like steel. "Then it's not guidance. It's gossip with perfume." The line hit like a dropped glass in a cathedral. Ridley backed off, murmuring something about checking with legal. The press secretary tried to recover, but Corin was already turning, his cape brushing past like a drawn curtain. He walked toward the east windows, where the chapel's steeple rose through misted glass. Somewhere behind it, the Queen's private memorial window stood, facing the courtyard. Empty. Waiting. The ceremony was 2 days away, and someone had decided the crown no longer had room to remember itself. But Corin wasn't asking permission. Not anymore. The logistics office at Windsor was one of those places you weren't meant to notice. No velvet ropes, no polished plaques. Just walls of beige folders, humming printers, and the quiet rustle of a monarchy managed behind the scenes. It smelled like toner and old linen. The place where protocol was printed before it became history. Corin didn't knock when he entered. The young clerk at the desk looked up, startled. "Sergeant, is there something you need?" "I need everything related to this year's memorial ceremony," Corin said, "and I need it now." The clerk hesitated. "There's been a—" "I know," Corin snapped. "Give me the paperwork." The clerk stood, fumbling through a drawer marked Royal Event Rotations, Q4. He retrieved a thin, unsealed folder. Inside, one memo. No signatures, no departmental stamps, no household seal. Corin read the header aloud. Modernization Initiative, Q.C. Revision 3. He flipped through. Phrases leapt out in bloodless corporate font. Consolidate overlapping royal observances. Eliminate annual redundancies across memorial protocols. Reposition narratives toward a living monarchy identity. His fingers curled around the page until it creased. Reposition narratives? He muttered. She's not editing a press release. She's rewriting the woman who held this family together. He turned to the bottom of the page. No royal crest, just two initials typed in italics. C.R. Camilla Regina. It wasn't even an order. It was a suggestion pretending to be law. Corin handed the memo back. That's not worth the paper it's printed on. The clerk opened his mouth, closed it, then asked softly, Was the Queen's ceremony official? I mean, formally? Corin didn't answer. He was already striding to the back wall where a locked filing cabinet bore the House of Windsor's internal crest. Access is restricted. I know the code, Corin said. He entered it. 4 digits. Not his badge number, not the Queen's date of passing, the date of her coronation. The lock clicked. He opened the drawer marked Private Charters, E2R. Within seconds he found what he needed. A single handwritten document, scrawled in the late Queen's sharp pen, folded once, still crisp, despite time. To the master of the household. Let there be one moment, once a year, where we do not speak, do not explain, do not frame, only remember. Let the guard march. Let the wreath lie. Let the chapel watch. And if the crown must look forward, let it do so, while still bowing once a year. Corin stared at the paper, then folded it, slipped it inside his jacket, and tapped it once against his chest. That's not nostalgia, he murmured. That's a command. He left the room without waiting for anyone's permission. Somewhere behind him, the printers resumed their quiet hum, spitting out programs for events that didn't matter half as much. Rain had come in overnight, not a storm, just enough to soak through wool and blur the outlines of things. The courtyard stones were damp, their ridges filled with shallow water that reflected the chapel windows in trembling fragments. Corin arrived just after 5 and froze. The chairs were stacked, the wreaths gone, the velvet ropes boxed. The memorial platform, the one built every October for her, was half disassembled, its frame exposed like a half-buried skeleton. 2 junior contractors were wrestling a folded banner into a service trolley. Another was untying the ceremonial cords from the flagpole. And not one of them looked like they knew what they were dismantling. Corin's boots struck the stone like a starting pistol. The workers looked up, startled. One of them, barely 20, dropped the tie cord he was holding. "Who gave the order?" Corin barked. The older man stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We were told to clear the area. Guidance from estate operations. Memorial no longer required for public visibility." Those were the words. "Public visibility," Corin repeated. His voice didn't rise. It compressed, grew sharper. This wasn't a media opportunity. This was her command. The man swallowed. "We're just following modernization efforts, sir." "That's all we were told." Corin stepped forward slowly. "You think modernization means forgetting who built these stones?" Another worker edged toward the trolley. Corin moved to block him, boots planted on the wet flagstone in front of the chapel stairs. "You take one more item off this ground," he said coldly, "and you'll answer for it in front of someone who knew her better than you ever will." The men froze. The courtyard was silent. Then, footsteps. Familiar ones. Curator Halberd appeared beneath the east arch, wrapped in a raincoat, nervously clutching a binder. His face twitched when he saw Corin. "Sergeant Ashwell," he said carefully, "let's not escalate this. We're not defying anything. This is just protocol." Corin's eyes narrowed. "Then let protocol look me in the eye and say it." Halberd hesitated. "The Queen Consort has initiated a reframing of royal observances. Things evolve. We're not cancelling her memory. We're just refocusing attention on the living monarchy." Corin looked past him, to the stack of disassembled chairs, the empty space where the wreath should have been. "She was the living monarchy," he said, "every day for 70 years, and now she gets filed under unnecessary?" Halberd shifted uncomfortably. "We're not debating legacy, Sergeant." "Good," Corin said, "because I'm not debating either. I'm guarding." The workers stayed still. Halberd looked at them, then back at Corin, and saw something in the sergeant's posture that made him retreat 2 steps without meaning to. "I'll speak to the royal office," he mumbled, "but you're treading close to insubordination." Corin didn't answer. Halberd turned and walked away. The men with the trolley followed, unsure whether they were being dismissed or spared. Corin stood alone in the centre of the courtyard. Rain tapped lightly on his shoulders. The chapel windows behind him glowed faintly gold in the distance. And the guards, every last one of them, had stopped moving, watching him, waiting. No one said a word, but by nightfall the phrase would reach every hallway of Windsor. The cold stream refused the Queen Consort's order. The rain stopped just before noon, but the air didn't lighten. Clouds hung low over Windsor like a ceiling that hadn't been finished. The courtyard remained mostly empty, save for the rows of stacked chairs that hadn't been touched again since Corin's intervention. Then the gates opened. 2 Range Rovers rolled in slowly, unhurried like they had every right to be late. The first stopped near the chapel entrance. The second, smaller and glossier, curved toward the courtyard centre and came to a halt beside the disassembled memorial base. The back door opened. Queen Camilla stepped out with the grace of someone used to being observed. Her coat was bone white, sharply tailored, with a brooch the size of a sovereign pinned high on the collar. Her gloves were cream. Her smile was polite in the way a scalpel is sterile. 2 press liaisons followed behind her, tablets in hand. A third aide carried a small camera drone box, sealed. She didn't acknowledge the guards, didn't glance at the chapel. She looked directly at Corin. "Sergeant Ashwell," she said, approaching, "you've made quite the statement." Corin remained at attention. "I've done my duty, ma'am." She stopped just short of him. "This display of mourning is excessive. The world needs to see strength, not sorrow." Corin's expression didn't move. "Strength doesn't fear memory." Camilla's eyes narrowed. "The monarchy can't live in her shadow forever." He responded calmly. "Then step out. Don't tear it down." Behind her the aides stiffened. One of them quietly closed the drone case. Camilla tilted her head, voice tightening. "You forget your place, Sergeant." Corin's voice was ice. "No, ma'am! I remember exactly who gave me it." She took another step, now inches from him. "You're romanticizing an old woman's reign." He didn't flinch. "That old woman carried the crown longer than you've carried its jewellery." Gasps. One of the aides inhaled audibly. Even the guards posted at the chapel doorway shifted, not in shock, but in solidarity. Camilla's lips parted, not to speak, but as if she'd just been slapped by something she didn't see coming. Her expression hardened. "You've crossed a line," she whispered. Corin remained perfectly still. "And you've erased one." She turned sharply, waving for her liaisons. "Prepare a formal inquiry. He'll be relieved by sundown." Without another word, she marched back to the vehicle. One of the aides lingered just long enough to glance at Corin. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Corin's reply was low, steady, and unmistakable. "Not as much as she will." The Range Rover doors shut. The engines rolled, and just like that, Camilla left the courtyard. Not victorious, not furious, just wounded, not in power, in pride. As the sound of the vehicles faded, a hush returned to the courtyard. One of the junior guards nearest the chapel leaned slightly toward Corin. "What happens now?" he asked under his breath. Corin didn't answer. He just looked toward the memorial base and stood his ground. The office they put him in wasn't an interrogation room. That would have made things simpler. It was a guest conference suite in the East Wing, polished walnut table, leather chairs, and a framed photo of the royal gardens in full bloom. A place for polite demotions. Corin sat without speaking, his cap resting neatly on the table in front of him. His gloves were folded beside it, undisturbed. Across from him, a Windsor administrative officer flipped through a file with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been told how to handle him, not why. "Sergeant," the man said without looking up, "Her Majesty's office has requested a formal pause on your active rotation. This is not disciplinary, it's procedural." Corin said nothing. The man slid a page forward. Non-compliance with a directive originating from the Queen Consort's press secretary. Not a directive, Corin said quietly. A suggestion. Without seal, without paper, without a single spine to carry it. The man blinked, then looked down again. We are instructed to evaluate your conduct for tone, interference, and reputational exposure. Corin leaned forward slowly. Reputational exposure, he repeated. You're worried that I made it obvious someone tried to cancel a Queen's command. Sergeant, Corin's voice sharpened, you don't get to postpone reverence. You don't reschedule memory. She gave one personal instruction before she died. One, and they're trying to bury it under polite press. The officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable. I'm just here to collect the documentation, Sergeant. This isn't about loyalty, it's about optics. Then we've already lost, Corin said, standing. The officer rose, startled. You're not dismissed. I'm not asking, Corin said. He picked up his cap, turned and walked toward the door. His boots echoed in the empty room like punctuation. He paused at the threshold, then reached into his jacket. He pulled out the Queen's handwritten note. Carefully he unfolded it and placed it on the table in front of the officer, not with anger, but with precision. Read it, he said, out loud if you've still got breath. The officer didn't move. Corin stared at him for one last moment, then left. He walked the east corridor in silence, past paintings of sovereigns who'd never needed cameras to justify their presence. Every step he took echoed with something older than policy, older than the woman in the ivory coat trying to redraw history. Back in his quarters, he removed the memorial ribbon from his locker, ironed it, pinned it to his jacket. Outside, the clouds were thinning. He looked out over the chapel roof, where the wreath was meant to go, where her window still waited. Then he whispered aloud, voice firm, then bow we shall. Because if no one else would remember her, he would, even alone, especially alone. By nightfall, the courtyard had emptied. The tourists were gone. The aides had retreated to their wine and denial. The brass doors of the royal chapel were shut, and the flag above Windsor hung limp in the still air. But Corin returned. No orders, no escort, no audience. Just him. In full dress uniform, boots polished, buttons gleaming faintly under the arc lamps that flanked the courtyard walls. He carried one wreath, not an official one, not the gold-trimmed piece delivered each year by the royal household, now presumably discarded in some forgotten storeroom. This was made by the castle gardeners, lavender, rosemary and thistle, bound with a single black ribbon. Corin walked it to the chapel steps and laid it at the centre. Then he stepped back and stood at attention. The silence was total. Rain misted lightly through the air again, soft and slow, making everything shimmer without sound. He remained still. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then came another figure, a young guardsman, not in rotation. Private Evering, fresh from Sandhurst, still too stiff in the shoulders. He said nothing as he took his place to Corin's left. Another joined, Corporal Denham, then 2 more. Within 20 minutes the cold stream was assembled. No orders, no commands, just formation. Word had spread, not through official channels, through boots, through whispers, through the kind of loyalty that didn't need to be signed. A single line of guards, shoulder to shoulder, staring straight ahead beneath the stone arches. A royal aide came running from the west hallway, panting under the weight of his coat. He stopped when he saw them. His voice cracked. "This wasn't authorized. You're all in breach." Corin didn't turn his head. "You'll be court-martialed for this," the aide added, his tone pitching higher. Still, Corin didn't speak. Until finally, softly, he said, "Then I'll march out in formation." The aide looked at the faces in front of him, every one of them slunt, steady, unshaken. He stepped back, as if the sight itself had pushed him. One of the guards, without breaking line, quietly lowered a lit candle to the chapel steps, then another. Within minutes, the base of the Queen's chapel was glowing, not with floodlights, but with reverence, a quiet rebellion, Not against monarchy, against manipulation, one that needed no slogans, no banners, no fanfare, only presence. The aide disappeared into the darkness. Whether he ran or reported, no one knew, and no one cared. Because in that moment, what stood in the courtyard wasn't insubordination. It was remembrance, made visible. Rain traced down their coats. Boots held firm in the puddles forming around them. Corin stared ahead, jaw locked, breath slow. He hadn't needed permission to stand here. He only needed conviction. And right now, he had more of that than anyone else in the castle. The sound of tyres on wet stone echoed across the courtyard like a second heartbeat. A Range Rover rolled through the south gate. No escort, no livery, no announcement. Just one vehicle, one driver, and one woman in the back seat. It stopped directly across from the chapel, headlights washing the formation of guards in muted gold. The rear door opened. Princess Anne stepped out into the drizzle without waiting for assistance. Her coat was waxed, dark green, belted at the waist. Riding trousers, mud still clung to her boots. She looked like she'd come straight from the saddle, and maybe she had. Her eyes moved once across the courtyard, from the wreath, to the candles, to the guards, to Corin. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped forward without a word. A moment later, the echo of another engine reached the square. Camilla's car. It arrived faster, sleeker. A second vehicle followed behind. Aides and security detail stepping out before the Queen Consort even touched the handle. When she emerged, she moved with practiced stiffness. No umbrella, just certainty. Until she saw Anne and stopped. "Anne," she said smoothly, "I wasn't told you'd be here." Anne didn't reply. She turned back to the wreath, studying the ribbon. Camilla tried again. "This wasn't authorized." Anne straightened. "It didn't need to be." Camilla's voice hardened. "They're staging mutiny." Anne turned slowly. "No, they're staging remembrance." Camilla glanced at the formation. Still motionless, still flawless. "This is a breach of chain of command." Anne stepped closer. "You cancelled a royal tradition with a verbal suggestion and no seal. That's not command. That's cowardice." Gasps rippled from the aides. Camilla's jaw flexed. "I was simply reframing outdated customs." "You were rewriting the only thing she asked us to keep," Anne said, voice flat. Camilla opened her mouth, but Anne didn't wait. She turned to Corin. "Sergeant." Corin stepped forward one pace, posture perfect. Anne extended her hand. Corin reached into his breast pocket and removed the folded note, placed it carefully into her palm. She unfolded it, slowly, deliberately, and read aloud. "Let there be one moment, once a year, where we do not speak, do not explain, do not frame, only remember." Anne looked up at Camilla. She didn't ask to be worshipped. She asked to be remembered. And you couldn't even leave her that. Camilla's voice dropped. "You have no authority to overturn." "I have every authority," Anne cut in, "because I was there when she wrote it. Because I stood beside her when she buried Philip. Because I know the weight of duty better than you know the weight of that brooch." Silence. Anne turned back to the chapel. "The memorial is to remain. Indefinitely. Protected. Recorded. Beyond amendment." She looked once more to Corin. "You've reminded the Crown why it stands," she said. Corin said nothing. He didn't need to. Behind him the guards remained frozen, not in fear, but in loyalty. Camilla didn't speak again. She turned and walked back to the car without a word, her aides trailing behind her, unsure whether to retreat or apologize. The doors shut, the engines rolled away, and the courtyard was still again, except for the candles and the Queen's note, now tucked in Anne's coat pocket, right above her heart. Dawn broke clean over Windsor. The sky was pale but open, the kind of morning light that made wet stone look like polished glass. For the first time in days, there was no rain. Only the soft hush of wind moving between towers, brushing gently over the courtyard. The wreath still lay at the base of the chapel steps, untouched. The The candles had burned low through the night, their wax melted into quiet pools along the edge of the stone. Someone, no one knew who, had gathered the half-burnt stubs and placed them neatly in a silver dish beside the door. Corin stood alone again, back at his post, reinstated. No ceremony, no orders, just a quietly returned name on the duty log and a polished uniform waiting outside his locker at first light. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. The Queen's window caught the sun for the first time in weeks. It refracted across the stone tiles in soft bands, casting a faint crown-shaped silhouette beside the base of the memorial. A young guard from yesterday's vigil approached, boots quieter than usual. He stood beside Corin for a moment before asking, was it worth the risk? Corin didn't look at him. Depends what you're guarding, he said. The younger man nodded, didn't speak again. He stood for another minute before returning to his position. Chapel bells rang once, not for show, not for mourning, just once. Slow, measured, final. A single note that travelled across the courtyard and into the still air, like the last breath of something too dignified to announce itself. Corin stood silently, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He didn't think about his suspension. He didn't think about Camilla. He thought about that first vigil after the Queen passed. How cold it had been, how still everyone had stood, how not one soldier blinked while Anne laid the wreath herself, and how every year after the ceremony had grown quieter, more precise, until now. Now it would never be touched again, not because it had been made permanent by press release or decree, but because someone had finally tried to erase it and failed. Corin's fingers brushed once against the pin at his chest, the same ribbon the Queen had given him when she reviewed his company after Helmond, faded now, but still holding. He shifted his weight, not out of fatigue, but out of peace, because the Queen's memory wasn't defended in speeches, it was defended by standing still. Was Queen Camilla right to cancel the Queen's memorial in the name of modernisation? Would you have stood your ground like Sergeant Ashwell, even if it meant risking your post and your name? Tell us what you would have done. We read every single comment. And if you believe that loyalty should never go out of fashion, tap the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next Royal Guard story. Share this video with someone who still remembers what the Queen stood for and still believes some traditions aren't meant to be redesigned. Watch another Royal Guard story now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time right here